Thank you all so much for joining. I'm very, very excited for today's session. Today, I have the great pleasure of being joined by Holly Raymer. Holly studied a Bachelor of Justice and Legal Studies whilst working part-time at Woolworths supermarket business as a checkout operator. She then went on to work in succession law at a small private practice in Noosa. A year later, she went back to Woolworths in their legal team, working on IT contracts for 3 years. She then moved into the claims team for 3 years, and then landed her current role in the digital brand and enablement teams. Holly's coming up to 10 years at the Woolworths business and has worked her way through the Woolworths legal team in a bunch of different areas, not only just assisting in day-to-day legal work, but also in areas of IT, intellectual property, and privacy, but then also leading the charge specifically as the point person on the Woolworths Innovation Hub, which is what I'm really excited to dive into today. This is a bit of an overview for the session before we jump in for everyone who is on the session today. We're going to be discussing the culture of innovation, process improvement, and technology at Woolworths and how that impacts in particular the legal team. The key drivers of Woolies' legal automation journey, including their decision-making and their processes and their business cases. Insights to getting business buy-in and the effective implementation of legal automation, and then how Woolies delivers legal advice at scale, reducing volume of matters by 80% and doing a whole bunch of really exciting things with some new tools in the AI realm, which we'll be wrapping up today's session with. For everyone on the session, please throw questions into the chat if you have them about anything that you hear or anything you want to ask questions on. At the end of the session, we're also going to be launching a poll to allow you to opt in to having a further conversation with us. So if there's something that you wanted to discuss at length, you wanted to have a conversation with the Checkbox team about, or you had any direct questions for Holly or members of the Woolies teams, please opt into one of those sessions and we can take the conversation further in a more intimate setting. All right, Holly, can I hand over to you to give a quick personal introduction?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I mean, I think you did a pretty good job in terms of the personal introduction, but as Dan mentioned, I've been at Woolworths in a myriad of roles over the past 10 years, at least in this stint, but actually for a few more years, sort of in my mid to late teens, working in store, which I think also really set me up for success when moving into the corporate in-house environment at Woolies, just having that in-store knowledge. So I've been here almost 10 years and, you know, my main focus right now is a division of our business called the Innovation Hub, which is a really small team within the legal team that was established to try and improve processes, create efficiencies within the team in particular, but also within our interactions with the broader business.
Amazing. Speaking of that team, talk us through a little bit about the structure of the legal team at Woolies and the team size there. What does that department look like?
Yeah, so we have a pretty big team. I think we're roughly somewhere around the 130 team members in our legal team. A big chunk of that is our claims team. So they have they're probably one of the largest sub teams, but we're sort of split into around 10 smaller teams within that broad team. So we've got things like our claims team. We've got the team that I sit in, which is digital brand and enablement. And it is also one of the larger teams, primarily supporting a lot of our digital business, as the name sort of suggests, and technology type work. And then we've got teams such as our Big W legal team, our supermarkets legal team, M&A, competition, etc. So the way our team structure tends to work, although it's tricky to directly align being lawyers, especially when you've got specialist lawyers in certain areas, is that we try and align as much as possible to our business. So hence why we have a Big W legal team, for instance. Our team supports a lot of our Woolies X, which is our online delivery, that kind of business. So as much as possible, we're aligned to the different areas within our business rather than being in specialist groups.
Perfect. Yeah, that's awesome. We're going to dive into a little bit of how that shape is supported by legal automation and innovation and bits and pieces as we go through this session. But I guess to set a foundation for what we're going to be going through, I want to dive into the why of legal automation, specifically with regards to the importance of innovation, process improvement, and implementing tech within the Woolworths business. Taking that Woolworths is quite a progressive tech business in a lot of the ways that they do things. Talk about the importance of that legal automation process there.
Yeah, I think Woolworths, you're right, is quite a progressive tech business. We've got a lot of tech people in our company, and we're really definitely trying to do as much as we can in that space to obviously create efficiencies. However, in saying that, as most of us probably know, legal teams traditionally are not necessarily sort of ahead of the tech curve. So I think that's often a challenge. Actually, is there technology and perhaps expectations of the broader business versus where the legal team is sitting in that progression. So I guess a big part of the why, I'd say, is around speed and volume of work, definitely. Our business is always doing more and more and more, whether it's, as you may see in the media from time to time, acquiring new businesses, so it's constantly growing. And increasingly, things need to be able to get done at a certain speed to not hold them up. We're really, here to support our business units and our stores. And so we really need to not get in their way, so to say. So that definitely is a big why in terms of bringing automation technologies into the legal team.
Yeah, I think that speaks volumes to legal not being like a blocker or a stagnator in process, but actually being a valued component or valued business partner into those business units to help them safely and effectively achieve their goals.
Yep.
In speaking of that, I suppose I'd love to dive into some of the significant ROI or the ways that you prove value in to those business groups. So what does it look like with regards to like stakeholders and how people are measuring value and how they're shining that back into the legal team?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess being a legal team, like most legal teams, one of the biggest parts of our job is risk management, and helping the business to advise on risk levels and sort of guiding them on that, rather than being what you mentioned in being that blocker, not saying no, essentially, although sometimes. And I think the way particularly that automation helps us to do that is by building the risk into some of these tools. So we've really found, well, at least personally, I think, having automation tools reduces a lot of risk in terms of templates, for instance, is a big one when we're contracting, because, traditionally you might have a situation where, and I know we certainly have this from time to time, where there are guidance notes throughout template agreements, and quite often, you'll have your procurement teams or business teams sending those on to suppliers or whoever it may be with those guidance notes in it, which isn't great, or just sending wrong templates. So being able to create automated tools to allow not only us as a legal team, but our broader business to manage that risk and make decisions that are, I think something that comes up quite often is, particularly in the realm of policies as well. You have all these policies that might be pages and pages long. The reality is people aren't reading them, I think. And by using automation to create really simple tools in plain English, is really assisting in managing the risk, because they're actually understanding what we're saying, but B, making it so easy that people want to do it, rather than making it so difficult that I guess people just kind of bounce around it a little bit, or constantly come to the legal team to ask the question because they just can't be, like, it's too hard. And then they get to a point that they can't be bothered trying to read this whole policy or work it out. So I think
That,
that's,
yeah, it's really interesting. That balance between mitigating risk, which is in essence quite a complex discipline with lots of moving parts, and then making that easily consumable for a business user. That intersection where automation can kind of play between the two is really interesting. So, tell me a little bit more about like how that might functionally look. Like, what are some uh, like key use cases that might have been involved in?
yeah. So probably the one that really stands out to me the most is that we actually, essentially in our business, everything has to be reviewed by legal unless it's exempt. And I think a lot of companies probably have the similar concept of an exempt contracts list or policy or something similar to that. And so we certainly had that. It was pretty outdated for one. It was probably about, I want to say about 10 pages long, for someone to work out whether or not their agreement was exempt or not. And it also wasn't necessarily focusing on maybe the risks that we now in this day and age see as being really important. So I guess there was a couple of parts to that. We thought, perfect, this is a prime example for automation. Um, so we not only completely rejigged that policy to align with the risks that we think are important to see in 2023, I guess, versus 2017. But it's also now an automation tool. So the user just answers a series of questions, starting with what kind of thing are they doing? Are they engaging services? Are they buying goods? That kind of thing. So pretty simple. And then from there, depending on what they're doing, they answer either 1 to 10 of 10 risk-based questions. Um, and from that process, they essentially receive an outcome as to whether or not legal review is required or not. So that's probably our most prime example of, making policy simpler and easier to consume.
That's so good, and I think hindsight is 2020. We look at a process like that, and it's like that makes so much sense. You've got these business users who are now serviced by a questionnaire that then gives them the information that they need to know, not to swamp the legal team with unnecessary reviews and things like that. But looking forward, before you'd realized that value, before you'd invented that process, what is the buy-in journey? How does it look like for Woolies to get buy-in from those business units and from the legal team to really engage with automation to make some of these value props a reality?
Yeah. I mean, for that particular one, the buy-in was not, it's probably not a good example of buy-in because it's a process very much owned by legal and, the approver is our chief legal officer. So it's very much not really a sort of decision that the business has any or much influence over. So that one was more of a, we're moving from this to this, and this is the new way to find out whether your contract's exempt, and that was embedded in our delegation of authority policy, which also recently underwent a revamp. But in terms of other tools, it's really funny, and this is a really good question because I have found personally business buy-in to be the easiest buy-in. And that's because I think majority of our business are very much used to interacting with different sort of more service areas, which is kind of what legal is, by way of an online form or by way of a request. So, if you want something done by the IT team, you need to submit a service request or a issue or something like that. Same with an incident, you submit an incident report. So the concept of interacting via, a URL link or an online tool is really familiar. And I think they see the advantages as well in they're not having to wait for the legal team to respond. So,
Mm.
they've got that 24/7 access. They can get an answer any time of the day or night effectively. Um, and then probably the other component to it that's really helped with business buy-in is not only being able to automate the legal process, but automate the business process. So this is something that increasingly we've been doing or seeing our business teams really interested in. So probably as an example, recently we undertook a process to automate one of our agreements. And in doing that, we engaged with the business teams that are involved in that process as well. So in this instance, it was our food group team. And they sort of said, oh, hey, actually, rather than this tool just generating the agreement and conducting, so it essentially it conducts a competition review and generates the agreement. Can we also, do our supplier onboarding like through there? So we've seen a lot more end-to-end tools where the business has seen that it actually can have great benefit for them as well. And I think that's where the business buy-in really, it's even more than buy-in, it's actually creating great business benefit in terms of time savings, efficiencies, and risk reduction, and also supplier engagement. So, making things simpler for suppliers as well to be onboarded to Woolies as suppliers or our everyday market platform as sellers.
That is fantastic. I really like that. And I think we've seen it time and time again where utilization sparks utilization sparks utilization. You launch a tool and then it's like, oh, this is cool. I could do so much more with this idea or this concept or this process. That first hurdle in to that initial utilization, I think, is a really key point to narrow in on. Launching something that is simple and consumable enough to not require oodles of change management, but also delivers enough value to spark that cascade of enthusiasm. So yeah, I think that's really, really astute. A couple of questions actually before we move on to the next point in the chat. Going back to some of the use cases you talked about. So the first question is for the use case with the questions which align whether a contract needs legal review. How often do those questions get reviewed and do things need to change?
Yeah, so we have a quarterly review cycle on that, just to review, the risk questions as a whole. And then in addition to that, we do have a feedback log type scenario or ability for feedback to be submitted. If someone, whether that be someone in the business team has feedback on it or whether it's someone actually in the legal team thinks that certain things should be updated. And the main reason we have it on a quarterly cycle is because any changes to this particular tool require our chief legal officer approval. So we try and minimize having to sort of reach out to him for this kind of thing too often. Although in saying that, if we do feel that there's an urgent change required, that will go up to him sort of immediately for approval.
Perfect. No, that makes perfect sense. And I guess the next question follows on from that really nicely. Once the decision is made to confirm whether legal input is required, is the relevant template then spat out as part of the automation or filled in as part of the automation? How does that work at this stage?
Yeah, so we actually have two tools. I guess we actually have another tool that sort of sits before the exempt contracts tool kind of comes into play. And that's a tool that we call What Contract Do I Need? So people actually start in the, if they don't know what contract they already need. I mean, a lot of our more seasoned contracting business people might already know, but if people don't know, they actually start in a tool that we've got called What Contract Do I Need? And they answer a very similar series of questions really in terms of what they're doing. And that will push them either to a checkbox tool that can automate that agreement for them. So that is all contained within the same screen. They don't go out of anything. It just redirects all in the one screen. Or if we don't have an automated tool for that yet, it provides them with a template that they can use. Or if we don't happen to have a template because it's something more bespoke, it can pushes a request via email through to the relevant legal team to assist. And then sort of because I guess that the intention of a lot of our tools is that they're generating more accurate first drafts. The likelihood is that there's going to be some changes required, and it's possible that legal is going to have to get involved at some point. So it allows them to generate that first draft, send it to the supplier, receive it back, whether that's signed, unsigned, with amendments, etc. And then from there, they can use the Does My Contract Need Review tool to determine whether or not it needs review. Because probably something I forgot to add is that on top of the risk sort of questionnaire, whether or not our templates are being used versus a supplier template, and whether or not there've been certain amendments also feeds into that review process.
Perfect. Yeah, I think that's cheeky clever in the way that you've got a portion of these documents that are auto-generated based around these rules and workflows, so a bit of a self-serve functionality. You've got this this middle ground, and then you're capturing all of the other requests where legal has to get involved almost as a foundational level. All of that going through a tool means that you can start to put effort into automating things that are taking up a lot of time in sequence and prioritize effort where it's going to be most effective. I think that's really cool. I really like that approach in terms of a holistic build standpoint. That's very, very clever.
Yeah.
One more question before we plow on. Do the lawyers create the templates and workflows themselves, or is it just your team that does that work?
So I'm not sure if this is directed at creating the templates, like the tools within Checkbox, or creating the agreements that gets that out.
Maybe the tools and the documents. Probably they have separate owners in that case.
Yeah, so I'll just sort of answer both to to make it easy. So generally it's a bit of both, to be honest. So generally the lawyers are creating the templates, the initial templates, although in saying that we already have a bunch of templates already, and sometimes often I will step in, because I think part of the whole process of automation isn't just creating one template. It might be creating merging a whole bunch of things into a singular template. So as a good example is in our IT contracting space, we had maybe 5 or 6 master agreement templates effectively. But why, I guess, is the number one question, when a lot of the clauses are the same in a lot of those, your things like liability, confidentiality, privacy, etc., that they don't change. Usually what changed for us was, whether or not there were cloud services, so licensing provisions for that, or if it was on-premise software, or if there were goods involved. So I stepped in that part to create, I guess, that combined template. In addition, with one of the lawyers, we sort of work together. So I guess it's a bit of both in terms of the template creation. In terms of the building the tool and the workflow around that, for the most part to date, that's been completely on me. Although we're trying to change that, and we're sort of taking some steps to do that. But regardless of the actual physical tool building, usually I will have sessions with the relevant lawyer or the relevant SME as we go along to work through that workflow as well. If I'm not quite sure, I'm kind of in a very, I think, lucky position in comparison to some others doing this work, that I've been in the team for so long that I happen to know a lot of the workflow. So it's very easy for me to create the tools almost autonomously. But yeah, I think it's a combination of both ultimately.
Perfect. No, sounds good. Very good. All right, let's jump on. I'd love to dive into misconception that we get hit with a lot, and that is that when a tool is deployed, that's the end of the process. Tool's deployed, it's out in the wild. You can move on to the next thing, or you can kind of take your hands off the wheel. Talk me through your reaction to that misconception.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's a misconception. I think firstly, I mean, coming back to around the time of deployment, I think and this is still something that I think I'm trying to educate some of our team on. There's a bit of a misconception that Holly's going to do it, and I might not need to really do anything. Um, so that's the first problem that I think I face at the deployment stage, because I'm building the tools, but I don't necessarily have the relationships with the relevant stakeholders that are going to be using the tools. So I think the biggest first step is a good communications plan and change management plan and training for those stakeholders. And in my mind, that needs to be undertaken by the relevant legal relationship person on our end. So some teams and some people I've worked with have been really good at doing that. They've held training sessions, they've put together packs to really communicate the change management, but other teams certainly aren't so good at it. And yes, I think that's the first biggest misconception, is like that I can just send a link to a tool to everyone with little training or context and sort of done. And then I think the second one around, once it deploys, that's the end of the process, is another good one, because things often change and they need maintenance, whether it's that templates get updated, and obviously that needs to be updated in the back end of the relevant tool, and what the responsibility is, I guess, and this is something that we're still trying to, I think, figure out the best way forward in our team, who manages that, because obviously you might get to a point where you've built, I think right now we're at, somewhere between 50 and 100 tools. It's almost impossible for one person to manage that. So definitely maintenance moving forward, and reviewing whether a tool is still fit for purpose, whether the template's right, etc., is equally as important.
Amazing. Yeah, I completely agree. 50 to 100 tools, that's a lot of space for one person to be across and to cover, especially when each of these tools has iterations and movements and changes, as we've already talked about from a couple of questions from Kate and others that have come through the chat. Let's move on to talking a little bit about the future, which I'm really excited about, AI and the future. Holly, set the scene for us. Talk to us about how Woolies is thinking about, from their innovation hub particularly, this movement in the industry towards AI functionality.
Yeah, well, like, I'll preface it with, we're very much in early stages, probably like a lot of people. I think not only as a legal team, but I think organization wide, it's quite a new concept, I guess, particularly Gen AI. But it's certainly something we're thinking about. It's something that, so for context, we hold, myself together with our process improvement guru, I'd say, in the Innovation Hub, hold roadshow sessions with the smaller parts of our team, and we try and do that once a year to effectively establish a pipeline of work for the coming year. And we had one in May this year, and something that came up quite a few times was, it was sort of around the time that the whole Harvey AI was really hitting, I guess, media. And that's something that came up a lot of times. I think people get really excited at the prospect, but they don't really know what it can do, or potentially what the benefits versus the pros versus the cons are. And there's a lot more. So I think people in our team are like very excited about it, but without a lot of knowledge necessarily. So I think that's a challenge, to manage the expectations is number one. But we're definitely really committed to looking into how we can use AI in our teams to assist, similar to what we've done with automation with Checkbox. And I know we've had a few conversations around it, and definitely, obviously, Checkbox's AI assistant feature that's recently been released is our first sort of step or into a bit of a test and learn with AI. And so it's, yeah, we're really at a very much a test and learn type phase, but it's something we're excited about, and we're definitely, putting a lot of time into particularly this financial year to look at and see how we can best use it for our team.
Very cool, very cool. Before we jump into maybe some AI red flags and things that you guys have discovered that are things at least to consider when going through the gamut of bringing generative AI into the legal side of the business, were there any key first stop use cases that you were thinking of using AI for, or any areas where you thought that it could be incredibly valuable to kick things off?
Yeah, well, the first use cases are definitely around chatbots. It's something that myself and another lady in our team actually were chatting about maybe about a year ago, whether or not, because we're Google heavy in our organization, and we were talking about how cool it would be if we could, other teams have these chatbots, but legal, we don't sort of have anything. It'd be really great if we could have a chatbot. And we did actually start some conversations with some of the IT guys within Woolies, and it sort of unfortunately fizzled out. I think it was just too hard at the time. So chatbots are definitely the first with this new feature, the new Checkbox feature. The sort of chatbot scenarios, 100% our first port of call. But then I think, moving on from there, something that's I'm really excited about, and I'm hoping is going to be particularly valuable in our team, is the sort of contract clause extraction sort of features and that technology, because particularly in our IT legal space, where, more often than not, you're potentially reviewing supplier agreements and not our Woolworths templates. Some of those features would be really convenient, because we sort of have a structure where we have a paralegal in that team who is able to assist with a lot of that work. And so being able to, use the clause extraction type software for certain scenarios, it wouldn't be everything in our scale. We've sort of, again, got a risk-based assessment we would do before pushing into that. Obviously makes her review a hell of a lot quicker and easier. So there's sort of the two key use cases that I think we're focused on at the moment.
That's super exciting. For everyone on the session, the clause extraction piece is a really interesting one, I think, in that it allows for AI to pull out and make known like certain clauses within a document, but then still empower a human to do final reviews and checks, just speeding up their proficiency, or really enabling their work to be a little bit more meaningful and a little bit more quick, delivering a little bit more value, which is really, really solid there. Holly, that's super interesting. Red flags. What do we think? Where do we see AI maybe being a little bit less useful, or any red flags that have come up in your early research so far?
Yeah, red flags is a good one. So, I mean, I think the first obvious red flag is where the data is going to go. That's probably the most obvious one for a lot of organizations. We obviously don't want our internal, like, potentially, confidential, sensitive information floating out there in someone else's system to be able to be drawn on. So that is absolutely the number one red flag in kind of any use of AI in whatever system it might be. The second one, I guess, is accuracy of information that it's providing, and the ability to sort of potentially determine, I guess, depending on what the topic is or what the policy is that we're say, for instance, creating a chatbot for, how much we mind if the answer is slightly off versus how much it needs to be 100% watertight accurate. So that would be the second probably red flag. They're probably the two key ones that we've been thinking about, in our team.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think they're both really, really important. Definitely investigating any AI product, those would be the first two questions I would ask. Where is my data going? What is it being used for? And how accurate is this thing? And is there a way for me to tweak that accuracy? Super, super important questions for sure. Holly, we're going to kick back to you in a couple of minutes to give you an opportunity to give some advice and words of wisdom to the forum. But before that, we've had another couple of questions coming through. So I might rattle some of those questions off. Megan has asked, whose budget did the tool creation come out of?
Yeah, so in terms of the tool creation, I guess it's all out of our legal budget at this point in time. It's sort of a tricky one, I think, in terms of budget. It's always a tricky conversation. I think as other teams potentially look to use the software more, we might consider a percentage cross charge to their budgets. But we're also really conscious that we're in still quite an early stage. Most of our tools are built by the legal team, so that's kind of one consideration. But we really want people to use Checkbox and want for it to be spread broader across the organization because we see the benefits. And so we're conscious in not blocking people from using it by imposing a cost restriction, so to say. There are certain caveats to that where there might be really high assessment use where we have flagged with some teams that there may be a cost associated, but broadly speaking, it's legal cost.
Perfect. No, that makes sense. And then a question that came in from Jonathan, any trouble with buy-in from stakeholders?
No. So broadly speaking, no. I mean, you're always going to have a couple, I think, of people that, are a bit funny about it. And not even so much in the use of the automated tool, but more because quite often when we're automating our tools, we're perhaps also changing the process. Like I mentioned with that exempt contracts review, we quite significantly changed the way in which we review contracts. So it very much for us moved from, maybe a financial limits and that kind of thing to a risk approach in terms of things that we see a high risk and match with our risk appetite statement as a company. And some people weren't necessarily happy with that because it meant that in some circumstances, more of their things actually had to be reviewed. So that is sort of the flip side of that. But I actually find that the buy-in issue is not with the external business stakeholders. Some of the difficulty I've had in buy-in is actually internally within the legal team. So with potentially, legal team members thinking that their business stakeholders are going to have a problem with it, so not wanting to provide it as an option. But what we have actually seen when providing it as an option is quite the opposite when it's communicated in the right way. So it's a really interesting thing to watch, and one that we're certainly working on and trying to overcome. But that's actually where I've seen the issues in buy-in.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. Seeing that business stakeholders probably have a slightly lower bar of acceptance than the legal team would think that they would, and maybe that's where that disconnect comes from. And having worked with you a little bit, Holly, you guys also have a really good fusion of both build for purpose, but also change management for launch. So that change management for launch component is something that's really important to consider as well. If you build it, they will come does not work with workflow. You must introduce and manage that change as well, especially with some of the more complex process changes that you've outlined.
Yes.
Final question, I think in the chat here. If anyone else would like to ask a question, now is your time. Speak now or forever
And I think there's a few in the
hold your
Q&A as
peace.
well, just FYI.
Oh, very good. Sounds good. Anna, we'll go into Anna's question next. Anna's asked a question in relation to workflow to determine if legal review is required. If the answer is no, does the workflow also suggest a business unit that can assist based on the answers in the questionnaire? I.e., if the answers suggest that this is more of a request for assistance from a regulatory team or something like that. What do we think?
So no, we don't currently have that built out in this particular one. It's very much just focused on the legal review. We do in some of our, so I guess part of that risk assessment questions within that tool do link in with other processes. So for example, if a project involves, the use of personal information, the team should have done a privacy impact assessment, which is done with the privacy team. If it involves technology, they have to do a security impact assessment, which is done by the security team. So, sorry, the third-party risk management team. So some of this directing to other teams is built into that. So as an example, one of the questions might be, have you done an SIA? And the answers are yes, and the outcome was X, 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 X. So there's 5 possible outcomes. But then the other response is no. And so if the answer to that is no, we'll say you need to go talk to the third-party risk management team. Here's the link to they've got a site that you engage through. So we do have that built in to it, but it doesn't workflow to the other teams at the end, if that makes sense. Hopefully that answers the question.
I think it does. A couple of others that have come through. Nina asking, does your innovation hub extend to creating compliance checks tools like work health and safety review?
We've done, I'm just trying to think, what we've done. We haven't done anything on work health and safety. We've done some work with compliance teams. So effectively, we're absolutely, like, at this point in time, we will help really any team that requires any tools to be built within reason, but for the most part, we'll essentially help anyone. So we definitely do space, particularly in our company secretary space in terms of share trading and the like. We're about to have our group risk team is actually about to move in to sit underneath my manager. So they'll sort of be part of our team. So I expect that we will potentially be doing a lot more in compliance type of space moving forward. But we also do not work health and safety reviews, but competition reviews and that kind of thing. So I guess the answer is yes, but just maybe in some different areas.
Perfect. And then the final question, I guess, before we pass over to final comments, I know we're a minute over time. We might just take this final question and then wrap up. Is Holly, I think you are maybe the best person that I would know to answer this question because you've been involved in dozens and dozens of these build projects. How labor intensive is the actual process of setting up the questions and templates and building the workflow?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question, actually, because the answer really is it depends on how complex the template and or the workflow is. So, personally for me, it could take anywhere from, I could build something in 30 minutes, but I could also potentially build, things particularly where there are multiple workflows and multiple different touch points and approvals. It probably takes, in terms of the build, it's not necessarily that long. It might in total be a day of time, but in terms of the end-to-end, getting it built to getting it ready to deploy, it could be, 4, 5, 6 weeks, because you're really relying on, when you've got so many different touch points and approval points and workflows, you really need to have the feedback and the input of all of those teams, and be feeding that feedback in and making adjustments and amendments, etc. So I'd say it's a couple of things: how complex the template or workflow is, and also the response from the SMEs that may be involved in having to provide feedback, particularly sometimes when they just provide a few too many rounds of feedback. I think the something I experienced recently in a tool, and I think a message that I always try to put across, because I think traditionally, and not all of our lawyers are like this, but they won't deploy something until it's necessarily perfect, which is not ideal, because at the end of the day, really, in order to perfect it and continue to improve it, it needs to be out there. And it's not about, at least the tools we build are really for our stakeholders in our business. So they're not for legal, they're not legal facing. So they need to actually be right for the business stakeholders and not for legal, in terms of the way they're presented and what the wording is, etc. So in order to get that feedback, you need to get it out there. So 80%, as long as there's no major issue, I think 80% is good enough, and get it out there, and we'll perfect it over time. So I think that's something that can get in the way.
Holly, I think that almost perfectly summarizes the advice section, the sort of parting words. Mary's just put into chat a few words that I think I'm going to maybe have tattooed across my back, which is perfect is the enemy of good. I love that. The mantra of iterative improvement and innovation. Mary, thank you for that. It's an amazing way to finish out this session. Before we close things off, Holly, any final words that you'd like to share?
Not too many, but I mean, I think that's a good final word. I mean, it's a journey, I think, is a key takeaway. It does take time. You're not going to be, particularly if I personally had no experience using any kind of automation software, or any, my level of tech use was not, I wouldn't say high, prior to sort of being thrown into building on Checkbox. But it certainly, gets quicker over time. The more you do it, it's one of those things, the more you do it, the quicker and better you do get at it. And the more you can get things out there, the more ideas flow in from the broader team, for sure. It's just that education piece, constantly speaking to them about it. So for example, this financial year in our pipeline, we have about 60 Checkbox initiatives that have been brought to us from the broader team. So it's a pretty huge list. Yeah, I think it's just, and support, I think particularly if you're a manager, one of the biggest successes for me is my manager. So I would have never have jumped into this if it wasn't for him effectively thrusting it upon me, but also encouraging and giving the time to work on some of this stuff. Because whilst it does take a little bit of time, a few hours a week in the long run will reduce, the potential work having to be done down the track. So I think it's just definitely support is a big one.
Amazing. I can't thank you enough, Holly, for spending the time with us. So yeah, huge vote of thanks, and we will see all of you in our next webinar.